As Luca lies motionless and the underworld begins to circle like vultures, a mysterious young black girl named Zara walks into the most heavily guarded hospital room in the city, past armed mercenaries, past steel doors, past every sensor money can buy, without triggering a single alarm. She didn't receive a phone call. She didn't receive a text. According to the man she's standing over, who hasn't spoken or moved in weeks, he called her, and she answers with 4 devastating words: "You're running out of time." In the underworld, Luca Moretti wasn't just a man, he was an earthquake. For 10 years, his word was law, his shadow was a death sentence, and his power was absolute. People said he had sold his soul to the devil to reach the top, but Luca only laughed at the rumors. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he had outrun the ghosts of his past. But tonight, the past isn't just coming back, it's coming to collect. The ballroom was filled with the elite of the city, a sea of silk and expensive cologne. Luca Moretti stood at the center, a glass of bourbon in his hand, radiating a quiet, terrifying authority. Then, without warning, the world tilted. The heavy silver gun Luca always carried, a symbol of his violent reign, slipped from his fingers and hit the marble floor with a deafening clatter. It was a sound that should have been impossible. Luca Moretti never dropped his weapon. The music died mid-note. The air in the room grew heavy, turning cold and thin. Men who had killed for Luca froze in place. The man who feared nothing was suddenly on his knees, his expensive suit crumpling as his body began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. "Boss!" Marco, his most loyal lieutenant, lunged forward, catching Luca before his head cracked against the floor. "Luca, look at me! Stay with me!" Luca's eyes were wide open, staring at something no one else could see. They were empty, void of the fire that usually burned within them. His mouth worked desperately, his lips trembling as he tried to scream, but only a hollow, raspy silence emerged. Then, with a sickening finality, his body went dead still. Panic, a wildfire in a crowded room, erupted instantly. Phones were pulled out, guards drew their weapons, looking for an invisible enemy they could shoot. But there was no assassin, there was no poison. "Luca, can you hear me?" Marco whispered, leaning close to his friend's face. Luca's fingers twitched once, a frantic, rhythmic tapping. His lips moved one last time, straining to push out a warning from the edge of the abyss. A sound finally broke through, low, broken, and filled with terror Marco had never heard before. "Don't let her." Before Marco could ask who he was talking about, Luca's eyes rolled back into his head. The king of the underworld was gone, trapped in a living coffin of his own skin. The reign of Luca Moretti had ended in a heartbeat, and the nightmare was only just beginning. Before we continue the story, I really want to take a moment to ask you if you could please subscribe to the channel. We are trying to grow this channel and I need your help. So if you do enjoy this content, leave a like and drop a comment. And if you could subscribe as well, that will be really appreciated. In the underworld, a king without his crown is a target. But a king without his body? That is a ghost story. 3 hours after the collapse that shook the city's foundation, the untouchable Luca Moretti lay motionless in a bed made of white sheets and cold titanium. The silence of the private hospital wing was louder than the gunfire of the streets. To the world, he was a vegetable. To his enemies, he was an invitation. But to the doctors, he was a biological impossibility. Marco stood like a stone wall beside the bed, his hand never straying far from the holster at his hip. He watched the digital readouts, the rising and falling green lines that were the only proof his friend hadn't already crossed over. "What's wrong with him?" Marco's voice was a low growl, vibrating with a desperate, suppressed violence. The lead doctor, a man who had stitched up countless bullet wounds for the Moretti family, simply shook his head. He looked tired, and more importantly, he looked afraid. His body is not damaged, his brain is active, but he can't move. Marco stepped into the doctor's personal space, his shadow looming large. "So fix it!" "We tried," the doctor hissed, his voice cracking under the pressure. "Everything. It's like something is holding him down." He hesitated, looking around the room as if the walls themselves were listening. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "This doesn't feel medical." The words hung in the air like a curse. Marco looked back at Luca, the strongest man he had ever known, a man who had built an empire on grit and blood, now trapped inside the very muscles that used to command an army. "Then what is it?" Marco asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. The doctor didn't get a chance to reply. Suddenly, the heart monitor beside the bed didn't just beep, it screamed. The rhythm jumped, turning into a frantic, jagged staccato. Marco spun around, his eyes locking onto Luca's. Slowly, painfully, Luca's eyes began to shift under the fluorescent lights. They weren't empty anymore. They were wide, darting back and forth in a frantic search for an escape. In that moment, Marco realized the truth. Luca wasn't just paralyzed. He was awake, he was conscious, and he was absolutely, undeniably terrified. In the world of the Mafia, silence is usually a sign of respect, or a precursor to a hit. But for Marco, the silence in Luca's hospital room was a physical weight. He didn't sleep. He stayed like a gargoyle at the foot of the bed, watching the man who had once ruled the city with an iron fist now struggle to draw a single steady breath. The doctors had no answers, and the streets were starting to whisper that the king was dead. Then, in the dead of night, the digital silence broke. Marco's phone buzzed on the nightstand, the vibration sounding like a chainsaw in the quiet room. He reached for it, his thumb hovering over the screen. It was an unknown number. Usually, he'd ignore it. Security protocol dictated that he never answer untraceable calls, but something in his gut told him this was different. He opened the message. There was no name, no return number, and no location data. Just 5 words that turned his blood into ice. "He belongs to her now." Marco's face darkened, his jaw tightening until it ached. "What kind of joke is this?" he muttered, his voice a low rasp. He didn't waste a second. He burst into the hallway, grabbing his tech lead by the collar. "Track this number, now." The tech team scrambled, their fingers flying across keyboards as they bypassed firewalls and bounced signals off global satellites. They worked with the desperate speed of men who knew their lives depended on the result. Then, abruptly, they stopped. "Boss, there's nothing," the lead tech whispered, his face pale in the glow of the monitors. "What do you mean, nothing?" Marco snapped, slamming a hand onto the desk. "The number, it doesn't exist. It's not just encrypted, Marco. It's like the signal came from nowhere." A heavy silence hit the room. Marco looked back through the glass at Luca, whose chest was rising and falling with agonizing slowness. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. This time, there was no hesitation. "You should not have ignored the deal." Marco's heart skipped a beat. "What deal?" he whispered to the empty air. Before he could demand an answer, the world vanished. The lights in the entire wing flickered and died, plunging them into total suffocating darkness. The medical machines began to beep wildly, their backup alarms screaming as the power surged and failed. Men shouted, guns were drawn, and the smell of ozone filled the air. And then, through the chaos, came a sound that didn't belong in a war zone, the soft, intentional click of the door opening. In the world of Luca Moretti, security wasn't just a priority, it was a religion. His floor was guarded by the most lethal mercenaries money could buy, backed by thermal sensors and steel-reinforced doors. Yet in the heart of the blackout, the impossible happened. No alarms tripped, no shells were spent. When the lights flickered back to life, the room was no longer just a hospital suite. It had become a stage for a reckoning. The emergency lights bathed the room in a clinical pale glow. Standing by the door, framed by the shadows of the hallway, was a young black girl. She didn't look like an assassin, and she didn't carry a weapon. She was calm, standing with a stillness that felt heavier than the guns pointed at her chest. "Who are you?" Marco demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and genuine confusion. He had seen ghosts, but he had never seen anyone walk through a locked mafia stronghold without making a sound. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't even look at Marco at first. Her eyes were locked on Luca, watching the man who had once been a titan, now reduced to a shell. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't a scream. It was a cold, steady fact that cut through the panic in the room. "You're running out of time," she said. Marco stepped forward, his shadow looming over her. "You sent those messages? The ones about the deal?" She shook her head slowly, a faint knowing look in her eyes. "I don't need to," she replied. Her composure was terrifying. She stood in a room full of armed men like she was the one holding all the power. "Then how do you know about him?" Marco pressed, his hand tightening on his weapon. "She called him," she said. The room went deathly quiet. Marco frowned, looking from the girl to the paralyzed man on the bed. "He hasn't spoken in weeks," he countered. "She didn't use his voice," she answered simply. The implication sent a shiver down Marco's spine. It wasn't medical, it wasn't physical, it was something deeper. "Say your name," he commanded, desperate for a handle on the situation. She paused. The silence stretched until it felt like the air might snap. Then she let it fall. Zara. The name was simple, but the weight it carried made the room feel smaller. She wasn't just a visitor. She was the one they should have called first. In the world of the Moretti family, power was bought with lead and held with fear. But as Zara stood at the edge of Luca's bed, the hierarchy of the underworld vanished. The guards, men who had survived gang wars and federal stings, found their fingers trembling on their triggers. They weren't looking at a girl, they were looking at an inevitability. Marco had spent his life protecting Luca from bullets, but he had no shield against the quiet power radiating from the girl named Zara. Marco stepped forward, his movement jagged and fast, fueled by a protective instinct that was rapidly turning into dread. "Careful," he warned, his voice a low vibration of threat. Zara didn't even glance at him. Her focus was absolute, her eyes pinned to the man who had once been the most feared name in the tri-state area. "He won't break," she said, her voice devoid of the tremor that usually accompanies a confrontation with the mafia. Then she did what no doctor, no specialist, and no bodyguard dared to do. She reached out and placed her palm directly over Luca's heart. The reaction was violent and instantaneous. The medical monitors, which had been humming in a steady digital rhythm, suddenly exploded into a frantic chorus of alarms. Red lights flashed against the walls, painting the room in the color of a crime scene. "Pull her away!" a doctor screamed, diving forward to intervene. Marco lunged, his hand reaching for her shoulder, but Zara's voice sliced through the mechanical chaos like a blade. "Don't touch me." It wasn't a plea, it was a command that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of everyone in the room. And then, as quickly as the chaos had started, the world went dead silent. The machines didn't just stop beeping, they went dark. The hum of the building, the air conditioning, the very sound of breathing seemed to vanish into a vacuum. In the center of that silence, Luca's hand began to move. It wasn't the pathetic twitch of a dying man, it was a controlled, deliberate lift. Marco froze, his breath hitching in his throat. "Luca?" Luca's eyes snapped open. They were sharp, dark, and terrifyingly alert. But as he turned his head slowly toward Zara, a chilling, unnatural smile spread across Luca's face, a look that had never belonged to the man Marco knew. "You came back," the voice rasped from Luca's throat. Marco's blood turned to ice. He knew that face, and he knew that body, but he realized with horrifying certainty that the voice coming out of his boss's mouth belonged to something else entirely. In the underworld, you learn to recognize a man by the weight of his presence and the edge of his voice. But as Luca Moretti sat up, his movements were fluid yet wrong, like a marionette being jerked by invisible, expert silver strings. Marco had spent a decade at this man's side, but the person staring back at him through Luca's eyes was a stranger wearing a familiar mask. The king had returned, but he hadn't come back alone. Marco pulled his gun instantly, the barrel leveled straight at the man he had once died for. "Step away from him!" he roared, his voice cracking with a terror he couldn't hide. Zara didn't move an inch. Her eyes stayed locked on Luca, or whatever was currently inhabiting his skin. "That's not him," Marco realized aloud, his hands shaking as he held the weapon. "I know," Zara replied quietly. There was a new tension in her posture, her fingers tightening as she faced the entity. Luca's body sat up with a sickening, stiff precision, as if the thing inside was still calibrating how to use human muscles. It turned its head toward Zara, and a voice that sounded like grinding stones and dying echoes vibrated through the room. "You look different," the thing said through Luca's lips. "So do you," Zara countered, her voice steady despite the darkness radiating from the bed. The entity inside Luca let out a laugh, a low, hollow sound that made the hair on the guard's neck stand up. "I waited for you," it hissed. Marco stepped closer, his gun trembling. "What is that thing?" he demanded, his worldview shattering in real time. Zara finally turned her gaze toward Marco, her expression grim. She didn't offer a medical diagnosis or a scientific explanation. She offered a truth that was far older and much more dangerous. "It's the debt," she whispered. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Marco frowned, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "What debt?" Zara's eyes drifted back to the thing wearing Luca's face. "The one he thought he escaped," she said. Luca's head snapped toward Marco with a speed that wasn't human, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "He didn't escape," the thing rasped, its eyes gleaming with a malicious light. "He just forgot." Marco felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. "Forgot what?" Zara's voice dropped to a haunting register. "The price he paid for power." In the city of stone and secrets, Luca Moretti was a self-made god. Everyone knew the story, a street soldier who rose to the throne through pure, unadulterated ruthlessness. But stories are often masks for a much darker reality. As Marco stares into the eyes of the creature wearing his best friend's face, the mask begins to crack. The power that built the Moretti Empire didn't come from a gun or a bribe. It was borrowed from a darkness that never forgets a signature. Marco lowered his gun slightly, his arm heavy with a sudden, crushing fatigue. He didn't lower it because he felt safe. He lowered it because he realized bullets were useless against a ghost. He needed the one thing Luca had spent a lifetime hiding: the truth. "What debt?" Marco asked again, his voice a ragged whisper. Zara finally turned to him, her eyes reflecting the pale emergency lights of the room. "For 10 years," she said, her voice echoing with the weight of a decade of silence, "he ruled without fear." Marco nodded, his jaw set. Because he earned it. He wanted to believe in the man he had followed into hell, but Zara shook her head slowly, a look of pity softening her hard expression. "No, because he borrowed it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Marco frowned, his mind racing through the names of rival families and corrupt politicians. From who? Zara didn't answer him directly. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the bed, to the thing that sat there with a tilted head and a predatory grin. "You remember," Zara said to the entity. A slow, sickening smile spread across Luca's stolen face. "I remember everything," the voice rasped, vibrating with a malicious glee. Marco stepped closer, the floorboard seemingly groaning under his weight. "Then say it." Zara spoke first, her words dropping like heavy stones into a deep well. "He made a deal." She paused, letting the gravity of the statement sink in. 10 years ago, Luca wanted more power than any man in this city. Marco didn't react. He knew Luca's ambition. He had seen it burn through enemies and allies alike. It sounded like the man he knew. "So he went to something older," Zara continued, her voice dropping an octave. "Something that gives power." Marco's voice went low, a cold realization dawning on him. "And takes something in return." Zara nodded once, her eyes flashing with a hidden fire. "Yes." Marco's chest tightened, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What did he give?" Zara looked straight at him, her gaze unwavering and filled with a decade of pain. "Me." In the high-stakes world of the Mafia, everything has a price tag. Luxury cars, silent politicians, and even human lives. But most men trade in silver and lead. 10 years ago, Luca Moretti traded in something far more precious. He climbed to his throne on a ladder made of broken promises, and at the very bottom of that ladder was a girl the world was supposed to protect. Marco had spent years calling Luca a brother, but as the truth unspools, he realizes he's been serving a man who sold his humanity for a crown of thorns. The room went silent, the kind of silence that rings in your ears like a gunshot. No one moved. Even the guards seemed to stop breathing as the weight of Zara's revelations settled over them. Marco blinked slowly, his brain refusing to process the words. "No," he breathed, a desperate denial for the man he thought he knew. Zara didn't argue. She didn't need to. The truth was written in the cold, dead air of the room. "He didn't know my name," she said, her voice steady but carrying a jagged edge of history. "Didn't know who I was." She paused, and for a fleeting second, the girl who feared nothing looked like the child she used to be. "He only knew one thing," she added, her gaze piercing through Marco, "that I mattered to something powerful." Marco shook his head, his hand gripping the edge of the medical table until his knuckles turned white. "That's not enough. Luca doesn't trade people." Zara's eyes darkened, a flash of memory sparking in the brown depths. "He did that night." Her voice became sharper, clearer, as if she were stepping back into the nightmare. "I was taken, dragged into a place with no light, no sound. Marco felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. And he stood there, her voice a haunting indictment, watching. He didn't stop it. He didn't ask questions. She shifted her gaze to the thing currently wearing Luca's skin. He just made the deal. Luca's body jerked slightly, a grotesque parody of a human reflex. The thing inside him let out a raspy, delighted laugh. She screamed, it hissed, the words dripping with a decade-old malice. Marco's grip tightened on his gun, his knuckles white with rage. "Shut up," he growled. But the voice, that horrible, borrowed voice, continued, and he walked away. Zara closed her eyes for a second, drawing a breath that seemed to pull the very light from the room. When she opened them, she was no longer a victim. She was a judge. "He got his empire," she said, her voice ringing with a terrifying finality. "And I became the price." In the underworld, a debt is a death sentence. You can hide from the law, and you can outrun the rival families, but you can never escape the gravity of a life traded for power. Marco had spent 10 years believing Luca Moretti was a self-made king, but now he realized the throne was built on a foundation of stolen breath. The girl he betrayed wasn't just a victim anymore. She was the personification of a ledger that had finally reached its final page. Marco stepped back slowly, the floor feeling like shifting sand beneath his boots. Everything he had built his loyalty on was shattering in real time. This can't be happening," he whispered, his voice trembling as he looked at the girl who had been the ghost in Luca's closet. Zara didn't offer him comfort. She didn't even offer him a glance. "It already did," she said, her voice a cold, hard fact that anchored the nightmare to reality. Marco turned his gaze to the figure on the bed. "To you, is this true?" he demanded, his heart pleading for a lie, for any explanation other than the one he had just heard. For a second, the room plunged into a suffocating silence. Then Luca's fingers twitched. It wasn't the powerful grip of a boss, it was a small, weak movement, like a drowning man reaching for the surface. Something inside that shell was still fighting to be heard. Zara saw the flicker of humanity. She leaned in, her presence commanding. "Luca," she said, her voice firm and resonant, "if you're still in there, listen to me." For a heartbeat, hope flared in Marco's chest as Luca's eyes shifted toward her, but the light was extinguished as quickly as it had appeared. The darkness returned with a violent surge, a shadow passing over his features that was almost visible to the naked eye. The thing took over again, its laughter echoing with a metallic hollow ring. "You're too late," it sneered through Luca's lips. Zara's expression didn't break, it only hardened into something indestructible. "No," she replied, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I'm right on time." The entity widened Luca's mouth into a grotesque grin. 10 years, it hissed. "I waited 10 years to collect." Marco's voice dropped, barely audible over the rising hum of the failing equipment. "Collect what?" The smile on Luca's face became impossibly wide, a predator witnessing the end of the hunt. "Everything." Suddenly, the lights in the room began to flicker with a violent intensity, and the medical machines started to scream in a cacophony of failure. Outside, the hallway was no longer safe. Screams began to echo through the corridors, one after another, as the debt began to spill over the edges of the room. In the world of Luca Moretti, there was always a way out. A bribe, a bullet, or a betrayal. But tonight, the exits have vanished. The screams echoing through the hallway aren't just sounds, they're the soundtrack to a debt finally being called in. Marco, the man who would have died for a king, now stands before a monster, realizing that some wounds can't be stitched and some sins can't be washed away. As the darkness closes in, the only thing standing between the underworld and total annihilation is the girl who was once treated like nothing. The screams outside grew louder, moving closer to the heavy double doors of the suite. Marco rushed toward the entrance, his hand on his weapon, but he stopped dead. He looked back at the bed, at the thing wearing his boss's face, and at the girl standing unfazed in the center of the storm. "End this," Marco pleaded. It wasn't an order from a lieutenant. It was the broken prayer of a man who had lost his hero. Zara didn't answer. She stepped closer to the bed, her movements calm and steady. The thing inside Luca watched her, its smile widening into a jagged, predatory line. "You came all this way," it rasped through Luca's throat, "for him." Zara shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. A heavy silence filled the space between them before she spoke the truth that had brought her back from the dark. "I came for me." Marco frowned, the words chilling him to the bone. What does that mean? Zara's eyes stayed locked on the darkness inside Luca. "He took my life," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the force of a mountain. "He gave me away like I was nothing." Her voice didn't break, but the sheer weight of her pain seemed to press against the walls. "So tonight, I take it back." The thing laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "You think you can stop me? I own him." Zara stepped into the entity's personal space, her presence eclipsing the shadow. "Not anymore." She placed her hand over Luca's heart once more, pressing down with a terrifying, absolute strength. The reaction was a cataclysm. The room shook as if an earthquake had struck the hospital. Lights burst into showers of glass and the medical machines let out a final dying scream. Marco was staggered back by the sheer force of the energy. "What are you doing?" he shouted over the roar. Zara's voice rose, commanding and clear. "You wanted your price? Take it!" For the first time, the thing inside Luca hesitated, its arrogance turning into a stuttering fear. Luca's body arched violently, his hands clenching until the bones nearly snapped. A sound that was not human tore from his throat, a scream of the void being pulled back into the dark. "Stop!" Marco yelled, covering his ears. But Zara held on. She didn't blink as the shadows swirled around her. "You don't get him," she declared into the chaos. "You get me." Then the world vanished into total darkness. When the soft emergency lights finally returned, the room was still. The machines hummed a normal, steady rhythm once more. Marco rushed to the bed. Luca lay there, taking a deep, rattling breath. His eyes opened, clear, human, and alive. "Boss?" Marco whispered. Luca looked around, dazed and hollow. What happened? He sat up slowly, looking at his hands as if they didn't belong to him. "Something's missing. What did I lose?" Marco looked to the door where Zara had stood, but the room was empty. She was gone, leaving no trace behind. "Everything that saved you," Marco answered, his voice heavy with the cost of the miracle. Far away in the deep silence of the night, Zara stood alone. She was no longer a victim or a price to be paid. She was free, her eyes glowing with a power that was now entirely her own. And as a new voice whispered in the dark that this was not the end, Zara didn't smile. She simply watched the horizon. The deal was over, but her story was just beginning.
If you like this story, please leave a like and drop a comment. Also, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next interesting story. We wish everybody watching a good health and light in our path.